one remembered when Elias Crowley first arrived in Black Hollow. The town itself was barely a place, just a handful of houses clinging to a dying road, swallowed by fog most mornings and forgotten by maps long ago. Black Hollow existed in that quiet space between somewhere and nowhere, where time moved slower and secrets sank deep into the soil. At the far edge of the town stood Elias' farm. The land stretched wide and uneven, its soil dark as dried blood. Crops grew there, healthy, tall, unnaturally green, but no one ever saw Elias plant them. No one ever saw him harvest either. And yet, every season, the fields stood full. Elias Crowley was old, older than old. His back bent forward like a broken branch, his hands gnarled and stiff, fingers twisted as if permanently gripping something invisible. His beard fell in uneven gray clumps down his chest, and his eyes were the part people couldn't forget. Pale, cloudy, yet somehow always watching, as if he saw more than what stood in front of him. Children were warned never to step onto his land. Stay away from Crowley's farm, parents would whisper. The ground there listens. No one knew what that meant, but everyone obeyed, except for one man. His name was Thomas Hale. Thomas arrived in Black Hollow during a storm, rain hammering the earth like nails, thunder splitting the sky in half. He was young, desperate, running from something he refused to speak about. The town had no work, no future, but it had silence. And silence was what Thomas wanted most. He rented a small, rotting house near the edge of town, close enough to Elias Crowley's farm that he could see the fields from his window. That was his first mistake. The first night, Thomas noticed something strange. The fields moved, not like crops swaying in the wind. There was no wind. The stalks bent and straightened slowly, rhythmically, as if breathing. The soil itself seemed to ripple beneath the moonlight. Thomas told himself it was exhaustion. On the second night, he heard the bells, low metallic ringing, drifting through the fog at exactly 3:17 a.m. He sat up in bed, heart pounding, listening as the sound rolled across the fields. It wasn't coming from the town. It wasn't coming from any church. It was coming from the farm. On the third night, he saw Elias Crowley standing in the middle of the field. The old farmer stood perfectly still beneath the moon, arms hanging at his sides, head tilted upward. He didn't move for hours. Not once. Not even when the fog thickened around him like smoke. And when Elias finally turned his head toward Thomas's window, Thomas slammed the curtain shut. From that night on, Thomas began having dreams. Dreams of soil filling his mouth. Dreams of roots wrapping around his legs, dragging him down, while something whispered beneath the earth. Dreams of Elias Crowley standing over him, pressing a crooked finger to his lips. "Don't wake them," the old farmer would whisper. Thomas woke every time at 3:17 a.m., drenched in sweat, the sound of bells echoing faintly in his his ears. He asked the townsfolk about Elias. They avoided his eyes. An old woman at the general store finally spoke, her voice shaking. That farm's older than the town, older than the road. Crowley didn't inherit it. He belongs to it. What do you mean? Thomas asked. She leaned closer. The land takes care of him, and he takes care of the land. That night, Thomas followed the sound of the bells. The fog was thick enough to swallow the world, but the ringing guided him like a lure. Step by step, he crossed the boundary fence onto the farm. The air changed instantly. It felt heavy, wet, alive. The soil beneath his boots was warm. The bells stopped. Then the ground began to move. The earth split open in long, slow cracks, revealing darkness beneath darkness that breathed, pulsed, and whispered in voices too many to count. Shapes rose from the soil. Hands, hundreds of them. Gray, rotting, broken hands clawed their way upward, fingers snapping and reforming, reaching for Thomas with desperate hunger. He screamed. The crops bent toward him, stalks snapping like bones, leaves slicing through the air. The hands grabbed his ankles, his calves, pulling him down inch by inch. And then Elias Crowley stepped out of the fog. The old farmer moved effortlessly, not slowed by age or pain. His eyes glowed faintly, reflecting something deep beneath the soil. You should have stayed asleep, Elias said calmly. What is this place? Thomas cried. Elias knelt beside him, pressing a palm to the earth. The ground purred. This is a field of debts, the old farmer said. Every sin feeds it. Every secret strengthens it. And every soul keeps it dreaming. The hands tightened. Thomas felt roots pierce his skin. Please, he begged. Elias leaned close, his breath cold and damp. Don't worry, he whispered. You'll grow here. The soil swallowed Thomas whole. By morning, the field stood quiet again, one stalk taller than the rest, its leaves trembling gently in the breeze. And at 3:17 a.m., the bells rang once more. Black Hollow woke the next morning as if nothing had happened. The sun rose weakly through the fog, pale and sickly, casting long shadows across the dirt road. Birds sang, though their calls sounded thin and uncertain, as if even they were afraid to draw too much attention to themselves. Thomas Hale's house stood empty. The door was wide open, creaking softly in the breeze. Inside, his bed was still warm, the sheets twisted as if he had fought something in the night. Muddy footprints led from the bedroom to the front door, then vanished at the edge of Elias Crowley's farm. No one went looking for him. People in Black Hollow knew better. By noon, Elias Crowley could be seen tending his field. He moved slowly along the rows, humming a tune no one recognized. His hands brushed against the stalks, and wherever his fingers passed, the crops straightened, leaves shimmering with unnatural health. The field had grown overnight. One stalk stood taller than the rest, its leaves darker, thicker, trembling though there was no wind. Elias paused beside it. "Easy now," he whispered. "You'll settle in." The stalk stopped shaking. That evening, the fog came early. Inside the town's only bar, a handful of locals sat in silence, glasses untouched. The disappearance of a newcomer always stirred old memories, ones they preferred buried. Finally, old Matthew Griggs broke the silence. "He went onto the land, didn't he?" No one answered. Matthew swallowed hard, just like the others. A woman near the fireplace crossed herself. "We warned him." "Yes," Matthew said bitterly. "We always warn them, but we never tell them why." The bartender leaned in, lowering his voice. "Because the land listens." The fire crackled, popping sharply, and for a moment it sounded like bones snapping. Matthew stared into his drink. Crowley wasn't always like this. That got their attention. "He was born here," Matthew continued, "long before Black Hollow had a name. His family farmed this land when it was still wild, when the ground hadn't been broken yet." The room grew colder. Elias was a good man once. Hardworking, quiet, God-fearing. But the land, Matthew shook his head. The land was hungry. Years ago, more years than anyone liked to count, a sickness swept through the settlement. Crops failed. Animals were born twisted or dead. Children coughed until their lungs filled with blood. The land gave nothing. Desperate, the people turned to Elias' father, Jeremiah Crowley, a man rumored to know the old ways, things whispered before churches, before laws. They said Jeremiah could talk to the land, Matthew said. Not pray, not beg, talk. One night, Jeremiah walked into the field with a lantern and a knife. He never came back. By morning, the crops stood tall and green again. The sickness faded, and Elias Crowley inherited the farm. But the land had learned something that night. It had learned the taste of human souls. The bells began soon after, always at 3:17 a.m., always calling. Elias tried to leave once. That's what the stories say. He packed his things, boarded a wagon, and rode until the road disappeared. But no matter how far he traveled, the soil followed him. Dirt filled his pockets. Roots wrapped around the wheels. By sunrise, he was back at the farm. That's when Elias understood. He wasn't the land's owner. He was its caretaker. Outside the bar, the bells rang faintly in the distance. Matthew's voice dropped to a whisper. The land dreams, and Elias keeps it asleep. By feeding it, someone said. Matthew nodded. By giving it those who don't belong, those running from sins too heavy to bury. The land smells them. That night, Elias prepared the harvest. In his barn, candles flickered, casting shadows that moved on their own. Symbols were carved into the wooden beams, marks not meant for human eyes. The floor was stained dark, soaked deep with old offerings. Elias washed his hands in a basin filled with soil and blood. The field is restless, he murmured. Too many memories stirring. The bells rang louder than ever. At 3:17 a.m., the earth groaned. Deep beneath the field, something shifted. Roots tightened. Voices whispered Thomas's name, and many others. Elias stepped outside, lantern in hand. The fog parted for him, bowing low. He walked to the center of the field and pressed his ear to the ground. "What do you want?" he asked. The soil answered, not in words, but in visions. Faces twisted in agony. Bodies half-formed, growing into the crops. The field was full, but it was not satisfied. It wanted more. Elias closed his eyes. "There will be a reckoning soon," he said quietly. But not yet. The ground stilled. The bells faded. Elias stood alone beneath the moon. A man older than guilt, bound to a land that never forgot and never forgave. And somewhere deep beneath the soil, Thomas Hale began to understand. He wasn't dead. He was growing. Black Hollow was built on a lie, not the kind written in ink or spoken aloud, but a lie pressed deep into the soil, layered with bone and blood and silence. Every house, every fence post, every step taken along the dirt road rested on it. The town existed because the land allowed it. Long before Elias Crowley became the farm's keeper, the people of Black Hollow made a choice they could never unmake. Matthew Griggs remembered the night of the bargain better than he remembered his own wedding. He had been a boy then, hiding behind his mother's skirts as the elders gathered near the field. The fog had been thick, choking, and the bells rang without stopping, low and angry, like something wounded. The crops were failing again. Children were disappearing. The ground opened in places no plow had touched, swallowing livestock whole. And beneath it all, there was the sound, a constant whispering, that rose from the earth after dark. The land was awake. Jeremiah Crowley had already fed it once, and it wanted more. They stood at the edge of the field, torches shaking in trembling hands, as Elias Crowley stepped forward. He was young then, face hollowed by grief, eyes already too old. "My father is gone," Elias said, "and the land is still hungry." "What does it want?" the mayor asked. Elias closed his eyes. "It wants what we bury from ourselves." The land spoke through him that night, not in words, but in understanding. It wanted sinners, liars, men and women running from guilt so heavy it soaked into their bones. Outsiders, drifters, people no one would miss. In return, the land would sleep. The crops would grow. The town would live. Silence followed. Then, one by one, the elders nodded. From that night on, Black Hollow became a place that welcomed strangers. They offered cheap rooms, easy smiles, a promise of quiet. And when the bells rang at 3:17 a.m., the town turned its back. They never saw anyone taken. They never heard screams. They pretended not to notice when Elias Fields grew taller after each disappearance. Years passed, decades. The bargain became tradition. Matthew swallowed hard as the memory faded. Outside, The bells rang again, soft, but closer than before. The land was stirring. That same night, Thomas Hale opened his eyes. Darkness pressed against him from all sides. The soil filled his mouth, his lungs, his thoughts. But somehow he could breathe. Roots wrapped around his limbs, holding him in place, feeding him warmth and rot. He tried to scream. The ground answered. Thousands of voices whispered through him. Memories bleeding into his mind, faces, names, sins, regrets. He saw murders hidden, children abandoned, promises broken. He understood then. The land didn't kill. It remembered, and it used those memories to grow. Thomas felt his body changing. His skin hardened, bark forming along his arms. His fingers stretched, splitting into tendrils. Pain flared, then faded into something dull and distant. He was becoming part of the field. Above him, Elias stood at the center of the crops, his voice trembling as he spoke. "I've kept my end," Elias said. "I've fed you. I've protected them." The earth rumbled. A shape began to form beneath the soil, vast and ancient, shifting just below the surface. The land was no longer content to dream. It wanted to walk. In town, dogs howled. Cracks split the roads. Houses groaned as roots pushed beneath their foundations. Matthew fell to his knees. "It's coming," he whispered. The bells rang louder than ever. Elias raised his lantern, eyes burning with sorrow and fury. "You don't own them," he said to the ground. "You never will." The earth answered with a violent shudder. For the first time in generations, the land refused to sleep. And deep within the field, Thomas Hale opened his eyes again, no longer human, no longer alone. The harvest was coming. The bells did not stop. They rang without rhythm, without mercy, shaking Black Hollow awake, as if the town itself were being dragged from a grave. Windows rattled. Doors burst open. People stumbled into the streets, clutching children, screaming prayers that no longer remembered their gods. The land had chosen its hour. 3:17 a.m. The fog rolled in thick and heavy, swallowing the road, the houses, the sky. From beneath the earth came a deep, grinding sound, roots tearing through stone, soil ripping itself apart. The fields moved, not gently this time. Crops bent violently, stalks snapping and reforming as something massive shifted beneath them. The ground split open in long, jagged wounds, leaking darkness and heat. Elias Crowley stood alone at the edge of the farm. The lantern in his hand flickered wildly, casting twisted shadows across his face. For the first time in decades, fear cracked through his calm. "I gave you everything," he shouted into the field. "You will not take them." The earth answered with a roar. Roots exploded from the soil, thick as tree trunks, wrapping around fences, ripping them from the ground like toys. One slammed into a nearby house, crushing it in a single motion. Screams filled the fog, then stopped abruptly. The town was being harvested. People ran, but the roads twisted beneath their feet, dirt turning soft and hungry. The land knew them. It recognized every lie, every buried sin. Those who had welcomed strangers with false kindness were taken first. Hands erupted from the soil, clawing upward, dragging bodies down screaming into the earth. Faces vanished beneath the ground, swallowed whole, leaving only rippling dirt behind. Matthew Griggs stumbled through the chaos, coughing, eyes wide with terror. He saw neighbors pulled apart by roots, crushed against walls, grown into the land they had fed for years. This wasn't the bargain, he screamed. The bells rang louder. At the center of the field, something rose. A towering shape pushed upward, formed from soil, bone, and tangled roots. Faces bulged from its surface, men, women, children frozen in silent screams. Thomas Hale was one of them, but he was changing. Unlike the others, Thomas thought. He felt the land's hunger, its memories flooding through him. And beneath it all, he felt anger, not his own, but Elia's. Elias stepped forward, placing the lantern on the ground. "This ends tonight," he said. He raised a knife old, rusted, stained with generations of blood, and pressed it to his palm. Blood dripped into the soil. The land recoiled. Elias screamed as memories tore through him. His father's death, the first sacrifice, every soul he had given to keep the town alive. "I am not your servant anymore," he shouted. "I am your jailer." With a final cry, Elias drove the knife into his chest. The bells stopped. The ground screamed. The towering shape collapsed inward, roots thrashing wildly before retreating beneath the soil. Houses cracked and fell silent. The fog lifted slowly, revealing devastation. Bodies lay half buried. Roads were split. The farm stood still at last. Elias Crowley fell to his knees. The land was quiet, but it was not dead. Beneath the soil, Thomas felt something new. Freedom and hunger, mourning, did not come to Black Hollow. The sun rose somewhere beyond the fog, but its light never reached the ground. What remained of the town lay broken and silent, houses crushed, roads torn open, lives ended or half buried beneath the soil they had betrayed. Elias Crowley's body lay at the edge of the field. The knife was still embedded in his chest. His blood had soaked deep into the earth, spreading like roots beneath the surface. For the first time since anyone could remember, the bells did not ring. The land slept, or so it seemed. Matthew Griggs crawled from beneath the remains of the bar, his body broken, his breath shallow. He was one of the few left alive. Around him, the fog drifted slowly, heavy with the smell of wet earth and decay. He laughed, a dry, broken sound. "So this is the price," he whispered. "The bargain was broken, and bargains, once broken, demand payment." The ground trembled softly, not violently, not angrily, patiently. Deep beneath the field, Thomas Hale opened his eyes. He no longer had lungs, yet he breathed. No heart, yet he felt. The land had released its grip on him, not out of mercy, but necessity. Elias was gone. The caretaker was dead, and the land needed a new voice. Roots loosened, soil parted. Thomas rose, his body pulled free of the earth in pieces, flesh half-formed, bark and bone woven together. His face was human enough to recognize, but his eyes glowed with the same pale awareness Elias once carried. He stood taller than any man should, feet sinking into the soil as if it welcomed him home. He remembered everything now, not just his life, but all the lives. Every soul fed to the field whispered through him. Every sin, every lie, every fear. The land was no longer dreaming. It was awake, and it was walking. The field spread, crops pushed outward, tearing through the ruins of Black Hollow, swallowing what remained. Roots followed roads, crept beneath nearby forests, stretched toward distant towns. Wherever they reached, the soil darkened. Fertile, hungry, Matthew tried to crawl away, sobbing. Thomas looked down at him. "You knew," Thomas said, his voice layered with dozens of others. Matthew shook his head violently. "We were trying to survive." "So was the land," Thomas replied. Roots wrapped around Matthew's legs, lifting him gently, not in anger, but inevitability. As Matthew was pulled beneath the soil, the earth shuddered once, then stilled. Days passed, then weeks. Black Hollow vanished from maps. Travelers avoided the road without knowing why. Satellite images showed nothing but endless green fields where a town had once been. No bells rang anymore. They were no longer needed. Some nights, if the fog is thick enough and the ground feels warm beneath your feet, you can hear whispers rising from the soil, soft, patient voices calling to those carrying heavy secrets. And if you ever see a tall figure standing in the middle of a field at night, watching silently, do not approach, do not listen, because the land no longer sleeps, and it remembers everything